On behalf of the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Nana Kogu, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Carol Bertram. The Vice Chancellor conveys his congratulations and best wishes to Professor Bertram. The DVC of the College of Humanities, Professor Nhlanhla Mkhize, and the Registrar, Dr. Kathy Cleland, convey their apologies and have requested that I extend their congratulations to Professor Bertram on her promotion, as well as their gratitude for her contributions to the School of Education. I would like to acknowledge the following members of Council, members of the Executive Management, members of Senate, our inaugurant this afternoon, Professor Carol Bertram, family and friends of Professor Bertram, academics and professional staff, students, alumni, and distinguished guests. A special welcome to our guests from other universities and organizations within South Africa, the African continent, and across the globe. Inaugural lectures form part of the university's public lecture series and may only be presented by newly appointed full professors appointed in academic schools and centers. Inaugural lectures present an opportunity for showcasing the exciting and groundbreaking research and teaching being carried out by professors in our university. Each lecture represents a significant milestone in an academic's career, providing official recognition of their promotion or appointment to full professorship. These lectures are furthermore an ideal opportunity for new professors to introduce themselves and to present an overview of their own contribution to their field. Inaugural lectures are also a platform for celebrating a professor's academic achievements. I now call on Professor Von John, the acting dean and head of the School of Education, to introduce the inaugurant. Seems that there may be a technical glitch at Pietermaritzburg. Colleagues, let us just hold on for a few seconds whilst that is being resolved.
So it's only 12 hours which counts. After 12 is done, which doesn't matter, he's speaking to these guys over here.
Professor Von John, are you around?
Yes. Okay, so Von, you can go for just unmute. Okay. I think it is unmuted.
Professor Von John, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Msibi. Distinguished guests, it's now my pleasure to formally introduce the inaugurant, Professor Carol Bertram. Professor Bertram has had a long and distinguished association with the University of KwaZulu-Natal. This began as a student of the university, resulting in the completion of 5 qualifications from undergraduate level to her doctoral degree. She received both Spencer and NRF Tutuga scholarships for her PhD study, which focused on the recontextualization of knowledge in the South African high school history curriculum. Prof. Bertram started a career in 1988 working for an education NGO based on the Pietermaritzburg campus. She became a permanent lecturer when the Faculty of Education incorporated the Edgewood College of Education in 2001. Professor Bertram's scholarship is broadly in curriculum and the sociology of knowledge, with specific interests in history curriculum, as well as in teacher professional learning and teacher knowledge. She has successfully completed the supervision of 8 doctoral and 41 master's students, mentored 2 postdoctoral fellows, and published 42 peer-reviewed research articles. Professor Bertram has been a National Research Foundation C2 rated researcher since 2015. She's an editorial board member of Curriculum Perspectives and the Journal of Education, serving as the editor of the latter journal for 5 years. She has served as secretary of the Southern African Comparative and History Education Society and on the executive committee of the South African Education Research Association, SAERA. In addition to serving on expert committees of Umalusi, Prof. Bertram's leadership roles include serving as acting head of the School of Education and Development and cluster leader for education studies, for the Education Studies cluster. Colleagues, I'm delighted to invite our Professor Bertram to come forward to deliver her inaugural lecture entitled Drawing on Reservoirs of Knowledge, Teachers Enacting Curriculum in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Vaughan. And to everyone who is here, we are trying to do a hybrid and a non-hybrid thing. And we're struggling to get the slides up on, I'm in room 67 for those of you who know the education building, but thank you. So after 25 years of teaching and researching in education, what do I profess? Asks Jonathan Jansen. An inaugural lecture is a chance to reflect on my research journey so far and to describe my research in a way that is understandable to everyone. My friend Jean tells me that her father, who was a classics professor at UDW, delivered his inaugural in Latin and Greek 40 years ago. And I'm sure you'll be very glad that I'm not going to do that. The fields in which I teach and research, as Vaughan has said, are broadly around curriculum policy, how teachers recontextualize curriculum, particularly history curriculum, teacher knowledge, and teacher learning. So in this lecture, I will engage with some of the key research projects that I've been involved with to draw out aspects of this concept of teachers' reservoirs of knowledge. For the colleagues here, I had some lovely pictures of reservoirs of knowledge, but the colleagues online can see them, I hope. I use this metaphor because a reservoir is grounded in a particular place and space and may draw water from a range of different sources. Further, the landscape in which it is located matters, and I will expand on this later. So teachers' reservoirs of knowledge are important because they inform how teachers will teach and how they will assess. These practices are visible, but the knowledge that informs them is not. Robin Alexander says, pedagogy is the observable act of teaching, together with its attendant discourse of educational theories, values, evidence, and justification. It is what one needs to know and the skills one needs to command to make and justify the many different kinds of decisions of which teaching is constituted. So pedagogy is not just a technical set of skills, of teaching strategies, but it encompasses teachers' knowledge, understanding, values, and beliefs about why they make particular choices. Pedagogy is also enacted in very specific contexts, which are located within a broader education system and a set of policies. And I see my research as thinking about the relationship between these concepts. So I structure the lecture around 4 key research projects and then draw out some overarching principles that underpin my work. The first project was the President's Education Initiative in 1999. The second is my PhD study, which was about the revised high school history curriculum in 2006 and how that was interpreted by both teachers and textbook writers. The third is a project which is aimed to describe foundation phase teachers and what they learned from a particular professional development project. And the last is about how teachers respond to the monitoring of their work and how they experience the tension between ensuring their learners understand concepts and the huge time constraint that they experience covering the curriculum. So in all these examples, I engage with how teachers draw on their reservoirs of knowledge to navigate the policy and contextual challenges. And as I said, all of this happens within this broader landscape, which currently are the neoliberal discourses, which reduce the purpose of education to measuring results and improving pass rates, which is where I will end. But to start, I reflect on how I started this journey. Like many teachers, I didn't set out to become a teacher. I hated my high school years, in fact, with a great passion, the particular passion of a person who could not buy into the hierarchies of authority and sexism. Here is a photo of my matric class year in 1986, Greenside High. I'm sorry colleagues can't see it here. You will notice the 1980s hairstyles, and you will notice that there were 250 people standing on those steps. I was a full-time student here from 1990 to 93. I remember registering outside the Colin Webb Hall with the same sweat we are feeling now, dripping down our legs in February. It's very hot here. Registering to do history, psychology, sociology, and political science. I was planning to continue my studies in psychology, and then I realized that, in fact, an average of 69 was not going to get you into an honors program in 1993. So I fell into a higher diploma of education and surprisingly realized that I like to teach. So also I never set out to become an academic. I fell into this too through part-time contract tutoring work and continued to do my honors and masters and PhD part-time. I feel very lucky that I started my academic journey before performance management, productivity units, key performance areas and workloads entered the discourse of higher education. My first teaching job was as a tutor on the honors module, curriculum studies, which was taught by Prof. Ken Harley. The leaders in the education faculty at that time were white men, but they had a very strong commitment to social justice. Head of school Ben Parker told me to go on paid maternity leave anyway, despite the fact that I was a contract staff member and had no benefits when my son Jonathan was born. Professor John Aitchison insisted that all contract staff in PMB were made permanent when we joined up with Edgewood, and many of us can be very grateful to him for that. I was a novice academic at a very exciting time, really, in the late 1990s. Curriculum 2005 was launched with a flourish, and I was one of many who embraced outcomes-based education, believing it would really transform education into something much more meaningful. What could make more sense than connecting learning to learners' lives, collapsing the boundaries between socially constructed school subjects to teach in integrated and thematic ways? Take the theme of water and use it to drive your teaching. The water cycle in geography, states of water in science, measuring liquids in mathematics, writing about rivers or oceans in language class. However, the approach underestimated the deep reservoirs of knowledge that teachers need to do this boundary crossing successfully, and also underestimated the value of the boundaries that the subjects provide. Integrated tasks can actually become really layered and complex for learners because the focus on context can make the cognitive load heavy and can actually obscure the kind of conceptual knowledge that they really need to learn. Many teachers did not know how to build good bridges that can cross boundaries between learners' experiences and subject knowledge. In 1999, just after apartheid, in fact, very little classroom research had been done, and the first extensive set of studies was, in fact, Nelson Mandela's President's Education Initiative in 1999. This set of research studies laid bare what the real state of education was in many classrooms and why this radically constructivist C-2005 curriculum was completely ill-suited to the reality of most South African classrooms. It was understandably symbolic. It was created at a time when deep segregation and apartheid boundaries were finally collapsing, and so it made sense to collapse the same kind of boundaries in education, except it didn't. The President's Education Initiative project was my first research project. I was a novice researcher with a group of colleagues under the leadership of Professor Ken Harley. The article we wrote from this project is in fact still my most cited work 23 years later. And I learned a huge amount from being a researcher through this project, both about observing classrooms, analyzing data, and that ethics and generosity is just such a key part of research. Ken had no ego to defend and was a very generous and expert mentor. We did classroom observations of and interviewed 10 effective teachers in good schools. The conclusion was that the vision of the ideal teacher, which was in the new policy documents, was as an autonomous, extended professional with a strong knowledge base and an ability to reflect critically on their own practice, was not really what we saw in classrooms. Many teachers' beliefs about the world conflicted with what policy envisaged. This was a quote from one teacher. The new policy is good, but there will be conflict between the government and the Zulu rural community. If children become more critical, they will start to question their parents' authority and adopt values that conflict with their community. And I think that is often still the case with our policies. Jonathan Jansen wrote in 2001, 22 years ago, teachers in the democratic ideal were going to be knowledge producers. They were going to take charge of their own classrooms. They would initiate discussion. They would select liberatory content knowledge for the curriculum. They would empower learners and they would change the world. It was a clear example of the state developing policy in the hope that what is would somehow be miraculously transformed into what was hoped for. And I'll return to this later about how the discourses of education have shifted. When Prof. Makgoba became Vice Chancellor here at UKZN in 2004, it became compulsory for all staff to complete their PhD. So I decided that I wanted to understand the work of Bernstein and used his theory to examine the recontextualization of the history curriculum. There was a new curriculum in 2006 for the FET phase, and I aimed to understand how this had been interpreted and recontextualized at various levels of the schooling system. My study was part of a bigger NRF project about curriculum and pedagogy and involved colleagues Edith Dempster, Fiona Jackson, Devika Naidu, Whitty Green, and Wayne Hugo. It was a brilliant space to learn and discuss and think about theory and research, and played a really important role in my own development too. There are three different kinds of knowledge-based activities in education: research, curriculum, design, and teaching. And again, I'm so sad you can't see my beautiful slides. The pedagogic device helps us to understand how knowledge is interpreted and recontextualized again across these fields. In the field of production, knowledge is produced by researchers. For example, archaeologists excavating Mapangubwe in Limpopo. The state then selects knowledge from that field and says we're going to put it into the curriculum. In this case, the topic, Organization of African Societies in grade 6. These are then further reinterpreted by textbook writers, by teacher educators, and finally, teachers in the field of reproduction draw on their own reservoirs of knowledge to interpret this official curriculum in ways that make sense to them and to the context in which they work. While policymakers still seem to believe that there is or should be a direct link between these three fields, in fact, we know that there is not. And in the spaces between each of those three fields, there's a huge amount of space for, as Bernstein says, ideology to play, for recontextualization to happen. And that was what I was interested in. The 2006 grade 10 to 12 history curriculum embraced the idea that learners should not only learn the what of history, but should also learn how history knowledge is made. The first learning outcome of that FET 2006 curriculum was the learner will be able to acquire and apply historical inquiry skills. These kinds of skills refer to how historians work with evidence, with their chronological thinking, their analytical ways of creating narratives. So the curriculum wanted learners to understand how historians use evidence, written records, letters, documents, oral reports, archaeological findings, to piece together visions or versions of what happened and to create particular narratives. So this focus on what historians do is known as procedural knowledge in the history curriculum literature. The reform required source-based assessment, which means providing learners with original sources to analyze. And here is an example of one from a textbook. But you can see that, in fact, the questions that are being asked about the source are not historical questions. They are questions about describe what you see, summarize the passage, They were not underpinned by historical thinking. So we got this appearance of source-based historical thinking, historical inquiry, but the substance and the nature of it was not really there. It was really hard to make that shift. An analysis of matric exam papers shows a very similar thing. Sources, lots of documents, and a lot of learners being asked to simply extract information from those documents. The work of my PhD student, Pranitha Bharath, analyzed sources in history textbooks, showed exactly the same thing, that things that looked like sources in textbooks were often not those at all, and they were simply comprehension kinds of questions. So why? One reason for this is because teachers did not have the disciplinary knowledge of history needed to enact the curriculum shift. Most of us were taught that history is simply a long list of dates and events, right? You learn them off by heart, there's one correct version of it. Under apartheid particularly, we know that there was one single story. And I have an example here from Boyce, for those of you who studied history in the 70s and 80s, A.N. Boyce, Legacy of the Past, that talks about the Great Trek as being the most significant movement in South African history. You didn't know that? So that was what most of us grew up with, and most history teachers did too, that single story. But this new curriculum reform was saying, no, we want history as many stories. As Chimamanda Adichie talks about the danger of a single story, and that idea that we need to understand that there are different stories and perspectives, and history depends on who writes it. So from this perspective, the purpose of school history was to engage with how stories are created, by whom, and the fact that they're different interpretations. But it is very difficult for teachers to do that when they do not have that same belief about history, or have the procedural knowledge that underpins that particular perspective. So what I argued here was that the curriculum reform at that time did not consider the nature of the knowledge that history teachers needed. Yes, they needed propositional knowledge of history, they needed procedural knowledge, but they also needed to understand how the curriculum had shifted the purpose of history teaching, and that was really a step too far, I think. And this idea about them having particular beliefs, because if history teachers are rooted in the one official story view of history in order to create that cohesive national narrative, they would not be able to implement the curriculum reform meaningfully, which led to the situation of the appearance, but not the substance of historical thinking. So the third research project that I want to go on to look at is one that I did with my colleagues Ibn Christensen and Tabitha Mukurezi. And my PhD student, Faith Kimathi. We know that teachers' content knowledge is absolutely vital, but it's not enough. The connection between teachers' content knowledge and how they make this knowledge accessible to learners has been the subject of many studies. And Schulman is the person who proposed this concept of pedagogical content knowledge, which he described in 1986 as teachers' understanding of the most useful forms of representation, the most powerful analogies, illustrations, examples, explanations, and demonstrations. In a way, the ways of representing and formulating the subject that make it comprehensible to others. And this is why being an expert in your field does not necessarily make you a good teacher. So we were interested in teachers who were coming on a particular advanced certificate of teaching course, foundation phase teachers, and we're really interested to know, well, what did they actually learn from this 2-year part-time course that they were doing? Is it possible to measure pedagogic content knowledge? It's a practical ability, Winch says, and is obviously most easily seen in classroom practice. So was it possible to describe in a test? This was the question we set out to answer. So because practice on PCK can only really be observed in a classroom, we decided that propositional and personal knowledge would be the most suited to being tested through a written test. And the first test that we designed for the, I think it was 180 students, teachers, foundation phase teachers who wrote the test when they came on the program, had a considerable flaw effect, essentially meaning it didn't tell us very much at all about what they did know. It only told us what they didn't know. So it was very unhelpful. We had drawn in part on Jill Adler's work here, that certainly for numeracy, that indicated the importance of mathematics teachers being able to recognize learner errors and respond meaningfully to these errors. So an example of a question we had, you can see it there, the ones online, a measuring error, a learner trying to measure a pencil, and we asked, the learner had started from number 1 instead of 0. We asked the teachers, what is the measuring error the learners have made? And all of them could say, yes, they started measuring from 1 instead of 0 on the ruler. We then asked, why do you think the learners made this error? And very few teachers could respond to that. And then we asked, how do you think you could help the learner understand their error? And nobody answered that at all. So this understanding of recognizing error and being able to engage with it was really clearly a step too far. And yeah, we didn't want to say that the teachers didn't have the PCK, but we recognized that perhaps we were saying that this PCK that was required for diagnosing errors and providing feedback may be just too high for foundation phase teachers, particularly given that in the cohort, most of them were in fact grade R teachers. So we then decided it would be more appropriate to ask them, what kind of examples would you use to teach particular kinds of content? So we designed a second test to engage more with teachers' beliefs, and we asked questions like, do you agree with the statement, children need a special talent in order to achieve well in mathematics? We obviously hope they would say no, well, maybe only a little. Or it does not matter if a child learns to read in their mother tongue or in their first additional language. And there we wanted to say, yes, it definitely does matter. It really does. And most of them, in fact, had the beliefs that were similar or in line with the program. And what we had shifted the test to look at was, for example, asking them, so if you were teaching plurals in English, would you use, which of these 3 would you use? Would you use the word box, sheep, or dog as an example to teach plural in English? You can see here that many of them didn't, or, you know, there was no real sense of why you would choose a particular word. And in this example here, the teacher has chosen box. But then 2 years later, or 18 months later, the teacher in fact chose dog. No, not sheep, dog. The question that would, you know, the rule that you simply add S. So there were some examples of how teachers have shifted, but overall, in the end of the project, there was kind of the sense that we really could not claim very much conclusively about teachers' knowledge and what they actually learned from the course, which as researchers can be a little bit daunting. However, we still published, of course. We also conducted focus groups, interviews with 26 of the teachers on their perceptions of the learning, which they felt they had engaged with. And that generated a very different perspective on the phenomenon. The teachers believed that they had learned new practices, while the written test was not able to corroborate that. So we've got 2 different methods, which were able to capture different aspects of knowledge and learning. And I think that's really important, in fact. In the interviews, teachers focused on the practical knowledge that they'd learned through the course, particularly this question of allowing learners to learn through play, which perhaps we had kind of assumed they already knew that. But they said, no. This is from one teacher. I never allowed my learners to play, and I did not have a play corner in my classroom. This year was my first time to allow learners to play because of the knowledge I gained from the university. Now I will continue with this practice. Another one said, I am the one who always said, shut up, be quiet, and put your finger on your mouth. But now I know that a talkative class is very effective because most of the learners are afraid to talk one by one. But when they're in a group, then they share ideas. So I allow them to talk. So there was a clear sense that, yes, of course, there was learning, but not easy for us as researchers necessarily to measure in the ways that we might, you know, that we might want to. So if we talk about or just reflect on those reservoirs of foundation phase teachers, I think it is probably for foundation phase teachers, the kind of knowledge they need is much more complex than many other teachers. It's deep subject knowledge in both mathematics and language, very good content knowledge, pedagogic content knowledge, especially about how to teach reading, as well as their beliefs about who learners are, who children are, what the nature of childhood is, and what is the nature of the child. And I think in that particular program, there was probably more shifting at those kind of deep levels about, yes, playing is good, rather than the kind of conceptual knowledge that we were trying to measure in our test. So in my discussion of the fourth research project, the last one, I want to engage with how teachers' enactment of the curriculum is influenced by the wider discourses of education. So if we go back to Bernstein's pedagogic device, which looks at this mapping of research to textbooks, to curriculum, to what teachers then do. But what Bernstein also argues that all of that is located within a much bigger set of discourses. And discourses here, I'm going to use Stephen Ball's notion that they set boundaries of what can be said and cannot be said at a particular time. These are often established by policies, politicians, departmental officials, as well as media and social media. At the time of outcomes-based education, the late Wally Morrow described Curriculum 2005 discourses as the scriptures that could not be questioned. 25 years later, I think we have another set of scriptures, which in fact are the annual teaching plans, if I speak to teachers in my class. These annual teaching plans are now very detailed documents for teachers that outline exactly what they need to teach in every week, what programs, what content, how they need to assess them. And this was really the focus of the last project that I want to speak to. And my colleague, Nonhlanhla Mtiani, is here, which is lovely. She was the lead investigator of this team that Jackie Naidu and I were involved in when we interviewed 29 heads of departments to understand their experience of working with a structured and highly monitored curriculum in the form what was then called the Jikamfundo trackers. So trackers are in fact just that. They track what teachers are doing. They are documents that then are linked to the annual teaching plans. Teachers are told, and it's linked to what's happening in textbooks, and it's very clear about how teachers need to work through that every single week. What is interesting with the tracker, of course, is that then at the end, I don't know, you can't see this, but teachers are asked, what were you not able to do? What worked well? What didn't work well? And what are you going to do to fix it, essentially, is what the question is in the tracker. So when we spoke to teachers, many of them said that they were unable to cover the curriculum in the allocated time because many of their learners were simply not operating at the level at which they should be in the grade. So in your grade 6 class, you might have learners who are reading at grade 2 level, grade 3, grade 4, doing mathematics. And so it becomes this intractable problem. Teachers described an intractable tension between the amount of work the learners had to get through, they were being monitored on this coverage, and the time that they had for teaching, and the time that the learners really needed to properly grasp the concepts. So many of them said that at least half the learners in their class are not keeping up. Which meant they had to move on, even though they knew the learners didn't understand. The teachers did not seem to have a sense of how they could differentiate in any way in their classrooms, how they could differentiate their pedagogy to really address this huge range of competences in their classrooms. So most of them said what they did is they did extra lessons before class, after school, on Saturdays, etc. This is an example of a tracker, in fact, from a master student of mine who looked at teachers. And I'm going to lean in here to read it to here. And it says, to the question, what will you change next time and why? She has written, I will also try and manage time to fit all that is required for the lesson, as learners got left behind on understanding activities due to the limited time and the lot of activities allocated. I will have to try and find spare time. So that's the teacher's response to this question of, you know, this issue and of the trackers. So I think this is a really interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in. The discourses then, which currently govern education, are strongly focused on measurement of results, and teachers' work is monitored to ensure that they cover the curriculum. The National Development Plan of 2030 says this: teachers, both individually and at school level, should be held accountable for learner performance, with due recognition of the learning environment. I'm not exactly sure what it means to take due recognition of the learning environment, although we know that it's absolutely vital, because we know that most learners in poor schools will have lower achievement because socioeconomic status is still the strongest predictor of school success. I think a key issue of the inequality of learning outcomes that the state has simply not addressed head on at all is how the child's home environment enables her to thrive or not at school. 40 years ago, Bernstein suggested that in Britain, the inequality in school achievement could be partly explained by the fact that working class kids in Britain have only one site of formal learning, the school, while middle class learners have two sites of learning, home and school. Obviously, the extreme levels of poverty in South Africa mean that working class is really a meaningless term in South Africa, but I think the argument still holds. There are 1.2 million 4 to 5-year-olds in South Africa, and 60% of them are living in households that exist below the poverty line. A recent study of 5-year-olds in early learning centers showed that only 43% of them are thriving, and more than half are not on track for age-appropriate development. So teachers can't be held responsible, solely accountable for the learning progress of learners who are not on track due to the effects of poverty, malnutrition, growing up without a nurturing adult, and intergenerational trauma. School is the only site of formal learning for many of these children, not to mention the source of a meal. Teachers in KZN try to extend this by teaching additional classes. We see this in grade 12 revision camps during the holidays, Saturday mornings. I don't think we really know what goes on in those classes, but I think we can assume that these extra classes work only if they focus on the transmission of knowledge. They work
Professor Bertram, we are unable to hear you.
Colleagues, we seem to have a technical glitch in Pietermaritzburg.
Teachers are only able to make it so. For student teachers, sorry.
You got disconnected a bit, Professor Bertram, but you may proceed.
Gone off?
Yes, you got disconnected at some point, but yeah, for the last minute or two.
Okay, am I back again? Can you see my slides?
You are back again,
No.
but we cannot see your slides.
You cannot see the slides. Okay, let me get those back. No, nothing there. Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, great. Good.
Sorry. Teachers are only able to take agency if they have a vision of how education could be different and more expansive, as well as the knowledge of how to make it so. So for student teachers who do not experience an expansive education in their own schooling, we need to open up those horizons. After all, that is what higher education should do. Ashwin says, a higher education entails students being transformed by the knowledge they are studying and thereby changing their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. So if we focus only on training student teachers to narrowly implement CAPS, we are not changing their understanding of themselves or their place in the world. The discourse that quality education now means increasing the pass rate is widely accepted, which is really a great sadness. While the official curriculum states that it aims to develop learners who are critical and creative thinkers, who can identify and solve problems, really education has become narrowed to schooling, which in turn has become narrowed to the achievement of measurable results. We now value only what we can measure, as philosopher Kat Biester puts it. And this is not a particularly South African phenomenon, nor limited to basic education. Globally, schooling is reduced to measurable outcomes and the comparison of these outcomes across schools and countries. Arguably, we seem to have lost our focus on education's role in the formation of people who are able to meaningfully participate in society as citizens of a free country, which is what our curriculum says, not to mention human beings who understand and accept themselves and are committed to building a more peaceful, more just, less consumerist world, which nurtures and protects our natural environment. So in conclusion, to sum up, these are some of the principles that I profess. Teaching is a knowledge-informed practice, but this knowledge is much more layered than just content knowledge and even pedagogical content knowledge. Subject knowledge is much more than simply knowing the propositions of a subject, but it is also understanding how knowledge is made in that subject and how to make meaningful connections with learners' lives. If teachers do not have this, they will not be able to teach the concepts and how they are connected to each other and to the real world, which is vital in developing critical and creative thinking in a specific discipline. Teachers' reservoirs of knowledge include their ways of understanding the world, as well as their beliefs about the purpose of education, the nature of learning, and their role as a teacher. The policy discourse of the ideal teacher has shifted from teachers who will empower learners and change the world to teachers who will get 100% pass rate and be held accountable for their learners' performance. The challenge for teachers, and I think for us, is to resist this technical and narrow understanding of the purpose of education and to support learning in our classrooms in ways that is not simply technical and results driven. Our task as teacher educators is to focus on all aspects of teachers' knowledge reservoirs. It is not only knowledge or cognition that influences teachers' practice, but Korthagen argues also that teacher practice is influenced by teachers' emotion and motivation, and I would argue also their ability to imagine something different. Teachers draw on their reservoirs of knowledge in their specific school contexts. 29 years after democracy, high schools that I visited in Edendale recently still have no libraries, no computer laboratories, no science laboratories, and no sports fields. It is difficult to imagine a more holistic and expansive education in this kind of physical environment. And this is where the Department of Education needs to step up and do its job and properly resource schools. I end with a reflection on being an academic in the time of performativity and managerialism. In the same way as teachers, we as academics need to take agency to ensure that we are not swallowed up by the prevailing discourse of competition and valuing only outputs that can be measured. Stephen Ball wrote 20 years ago, performativity requires individual practitioners to organize themselves as a response to targets, indicators, and evaluations, to set aside personal beliefs and commitments and live an existence of calculation. This existence of calculation means that we can sometimes become focused only on our own advancement and start to believe the myth that high productivity units and numbers of students graduated are in fact evidence of excellence, but they are merely proxies, and very poor proxies at that. So in contrast, I want to support an academia that nurtures process and becoming over perfection and competition. This comes from the manifesto of A Good Enough Professor by Karen Gonzalez Rice. And I was drawn to this idea of a good enough professor as Winnicott's idea of a good enough mother or parent. And in fact, when you Google good enough professor, you in fact find that there was a professor, good enough, who was a Nobel laureate and who may have been sad that his surname was not exceptional. But in closing, let us do our work well, but not at the expense of our own sanity, our own health, and our own collegiality. Let us be generous with our time and expertise in a university that wants to count everything. As Annie Dillard says, poet, the impulse to keep to yourself what you have learned is not only shameful, it is destructive. Anything you do not give freely and abundantly becomes lost to you. You open your safe and you find ashes. Thank you.
Professor Bertram, congratulations. What a wonderful lecture. It is now my pleasure to come up again on this podium and deliver a vote of thanks. I want to thank Professor Bertram for an inspiring lecture. It is clear that Professor Bertram indeed has something to profess. The depth and quality of your work, Professor Bertram, was evident throughout the outstanding lecture that we received this afternoon. This lecture was indeed a reservoir of knowledge. You've challenged us about the real value and purpose for education. And one would argue, as you concluded, that there are many implications for us in higher education based on the various studies that you've undertaken, albeit at basic education level. I really liked the idea of valuing process and becoming over perfection and competition. I also want to thank you, Professor Bertram, for your leadership role that you have played in the school, in the college, in the university, and the community at large. Your persistent efforts at improving education generally and teaching specifically are worthy of recognition and commendation. We are truly grateful to your family who have contributed to you being the person that you are. Today's lecture has been attended by delegates from near and far within UKZN, the province, the country, and internationally. There are too many of them to mention, but I want to thank them all for being present today. Thank you for joining us in celebrating Professor Bertram's success. Finally, Professor Bertram, I would like to thank your family, colleagues in the School of Education, and all your mentors, that some of whom you mentioned in your lecture, locally and internationally, will continue to support you, the school, and the university. To all of you for attending this lecture to celebrate Professor Bertram, I thank you once more. This lecture would not have been possible without the sterling professional support that we have received from the registrar's team led by Dr. Kathy Cleland and the corporate relations team led by Ms. Noma Zondo and her team. Thank you for organizing yet another wonderful inaugural lecture. With those words, I thank all of you, and may you go in peace and have a wonderful afternoon. Congratulations once more, Professor Bertram.